Hey everyone, it's Cameron here and I'm back with a brand new video, and today I wanted to talk to you about how to focus. And I don't just mean focusing in the short-term sense, like being able to sit down for like an hour and doing a task, but what I mean is also the long-term focus, because both matter and they're both intertwined together. And generally speaking, when you try to find content around focus, you see one side or the other, like how to focus on doing a particular task, or having like long-term sort of strategic focus, but you never see how both of them are intertwined together. So you have to kind of piece that together. So I thought I would kind of make this video to try to talk about that further and expand upon. I just dropped my pen. But to also expand upon a point that I made in my last video, which was about how to work hard, smarter. But towards the end, I talked about focus, and I thought that this topic of focus deserved its own video because there's actually quite a lot to go into it. So yeah, let's get into it. So from the last video, I talked about focus essentially being, well, if we look at what focus is in a binary sense, right? To have focus, you cannot have distraction, right? So it's effectively binary. If you are focused, you're not distracted. And similarly, if you're distracted, you're not focused, right? So I just wanted to put it out there so at least in an abstract way, it's actually relatively simple, but so just if you think about it from that perspective, so if you want to use it as a litmus test, so if you're doing something and you're engaged and you're focused, then you know that you're not distracted. But if you feel like you are doing something that you're not entirely focused, then you know you're distracted, because it's one or the other. Either you are focused or you're not focused. And it's one of the two. So that's just a good litmus test, and I just want to start off by repeating the same point from the last video, which was about focus, and that singular point that focus can be just seen as at least in an abstract way, it can be seen in a binary way. So you are either focused or you are distracted, one of the two. And let's talk about distractions, because there's two types of distractions, right? There's obvious distractions and there's non-obvious distractions. So what do I mean by obvious distractions? So obvious distractions are things that where you inherently know whether something is distracting, right? So, for example, you've got to write. I'm just debating whether or not I should draw this or not. Say, example, you have to write a paper, right? So you have to write a paper, but instead you're playing video games, right? That's an obvious distraction. You're obviously not doing the task that you're supposed to do. You're not doing something that's contributing to that task. Instead, you're doing something that is completely like far removed from actually doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing. So that's how you know that's like an obvious example, right? Like, like if you're doom scrolling through social media, or you are playing video games, or even just overindulging on music, right? Or doing things that are just generally like activities which are just procrastination, and they're not actually doing the thing, or they're not actually moving the needle forward. You know that those are just things that are obvious distractions. And there's way too much content about that, so I'm not going to dive too deep into it. But the only thing I'll say about obvious distractions is that you know inherently that you shouldn't do this. And in fact, just as a side note, as human beings, we have all of the answers that we're looking for. But it's just about whether or not you are prepared to ask the right questions, and if you are prepared to hear the brutal answers that you get back. So if you ask the right questions, you'll get the right answers. And when you're focusing, if you ask yourself a question that, is this actually focus? Am I actually doing what I need to be doing? A lot of the times, the answer is probably no. But I want to get onto the second type of distraction, which is way more lethal, and these are the non-obvious examples. So I've just made a few points here. Okay, so the non-obvious distractions, right? So non-obvious distractions are like, they sound reasonable, right? So with your obvious distractions, we know that playing video games, listening, overindulging in music, for example, or doom scrolling on social media, those things are obviously distractions, right? You know that you should not be doing that. The harder part is the non-obvious part, and the non-obvious part is the things that give the impression that you're moving the needle forward, but they're not actually moving the needle forward. So what do I mean by this? So these are things which give you the impression that they are relevant to the task at hand and to the goal you're trying to accomplish, but they don't actually move the needle forward, right? They're effectively, I guess, to be a bit more to use a bit of strong language here. It's basically just mental masturbation, right? It feels good, right, that you're doing it and you think you're being productive, but you're not actually being productive. It's like the same effect that you get from like watching a YouTube video about productivity, for example, right? You think that, oh, I've learned all of these valuable insights about how to be productive, but you've not actually used any of them. They're completely irrelevant to you, and they are not making you any more productive or focused. And these these activities essentially abstract away from the core focus of what you need to be doing. So these are things that you do that are not action oriented, that are related. So these are these are ideas that essentially detract from the core focus. So this is imagine this is a circle. I mean, this obviously I've just drawn a circle. Okay, and this is like, imagine this is like the end goal, and you are here, right? You need to go from this point to this point, right? The obvious way is to do this single action, right? But so this is the actions that you need to take in order to do it. However, what you might end up thinking about is going this way, which is slightly longer. You still kind of get there in the end, but during that process, you're kind of doing all of these things which are like, you know, which I'll just put as non-obvious distractions, right? Non-obvious distractions, right? You still do the action eventually at some point, but you delay that. You end up reaching that point at a much later time because of the fact that you have done all of these actions which are not actively contributing to the end goal. And these are super, super deadly because they sound so reasonable, right? So like if you're starting a business, for example, buying, so making a logo, that sounds like such a reasonable thing to do, but that's not actually getting to the end goal of, you know, having a functional or an operational company. That's not how it works, right? To have an operational company, what do you need? You have some sort of a product or service. You need to have market demand, and you need to be able to sell that product and, you know, distribute that product effectively. And in exchange for delivering value, you need to be able to capture some of the value that you've created, right? Like X% of the value you create, X% of the value you created of Y. So that's, but you might think, oh yeah, I'm creating a logo because I'm, you know, it's super important for branding purposes or whatever. You can give a bullshit justification for it, but you know inherently that it's not the truth and that it is absolutely and utterly distracting. And like another example I'll give, because I'll give a few different examples. So, say example, you're in school and you've got to write a paper. Okay, so you have to write this paper. So, or actually, no, you've got a test. You've got a test coming up, so you have to study for this. You've got a revision guide. You've got like a pen. You've got some paper to write notes and stuff with. But so what does like action look like? Action would look like, you know, reading your revision guide, writing down the notes, for example, right? Or doing some exam papers. A non-obvious distraction could look like spending time on Amazon to determine what color coordination you want your notes to be, right? And there are some people that I remember from when I was in school, people did this a lot. Or buying different highlighters, for example, because you want to color coordinate your notes, or buying these specifically sized cards because you want to create flashcards, right? And you just purchased them. You haven't actually created the notes. You've not actually done anything that's moved the needle forward or got you towards the end goal, but you think that, hey, I'm taking a step closer in the right direction. And while you think you might be taking a step towards the right direction, you're actually just obfuscating from the thing that you need to do. And the reason you're obfuscating from that is because the thing you need to do is harder, it's more boring, and doing the non-obvious distractions, right, gives you that hit of dopamine that you're after. Because as human beings, we are craving dopamine, and when you are doing when you're doing obvious distractions, you're getting that hit of dopamine instantly. When you're scrolling through social media, you're getting that instant gratification, right? Um, with non-obvious distractions, it's the barrier to receiving that dopamine hit is slightly higher, but it's not as high as actually doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. So when you do the non-obvious distraction, right, you think you're accomplishing something, right? So you get that dopamine hit, but in reality, you've not actually moved the needle forward at all. And that's the very deadly thing about these non-obvious distractions. They sound so plausible. You can find so many ways to justify how reasonable they are, but in fact, they are complete distractions. So just find my tissues. The next thing that's actually a non-obvious distraction I want to talk about very, very briefly is early expansions before mastering your fundamentals. So what do I mean by this? So imagine we're making a building, right? So we've got this pyramid, right? We've got layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and then we've got this top. Let's just give it a triangle, right? Now, as you go up this pyramid, things become more fun, right? This bottom layer is super, super boring, right? And essentially the level of effort, and then essentially, let's just say the amount of effort required is higher as the blocks get wide, as the blocks are wider, the level of effort needed is higher. Let's just say that, for example, right? So this boring bottom block has the most effort. This one has second most, but this top one has barely any, right? So at the top you get the best of both worlds. You get least amount of effort and most amount of enjoyment, right? And the reason why the mistake that people generally make is without mastering this fundamental building block, they just try to jump straight to the top by doing the more fun things because they're more fun, right? Because you'll get that hit of dopamine more easily, and you'll feel like you're accomplishing something, but you can't actually get to this point properly until you get the basics right, until you get the foundational principles right. An example of this is people who are asking for tactical business advice, for example, like, oh, how do I scale XYZ thing, right? Like Facebook does, I don't know, whatever you're into, right? Or how do I write this method in Python, whatever, right? Like something kind of fun, more sexy to do, but not the boring things. And the reason why this is an issue is because if you ignore the fundamentals without mastering the fundamentals, you will never get to the top, right? So you're expanding too fast without actually conquering and mastering the fundamental things. And you can take this up in any sort of realm in life. So, for example, you are revising, you're studying, right? And you have to learn. So let's say, example, this is topic A. Let's say that's topic A, B, C, D, E, right? You have to get topic A like perfect, right, in order to have a very, very strong grasp of E. But E looks way more fun, right? And it seems easier to do. You've got a relative grasp of A, like you feel like you're sort of confident. You're not like 100%, but you're like 60, 70%. You're like, good enough. Let's move to the next thing for the sake of just getting things out of the way. So you move on to B. You get about 60, 70% of the way there. Then you get to C, 60, 70% of the way again. D, 60, 70% of the way again. E. And boom, you are at the top, and you're like, yeah, I've got a strong grasp of all of this, but you've not got any grasp of anything in extreme confidence. And the reason being is because you lack the fundamentals. If you decide that if you're at a point where you're just like, okay, I feel somewhat confident, but I'm just going to move on for the sake of it and just get on to the next thing, you're going to miss out the foundations. And if you don't get the foundations right, you can never get the top to be perfect. And I realize this is I've just gone a little bit of a ramble right there about getting the foundations correct. And this isn't always true. You need to pick and choose your battles. And this is mainly what the point I'm making here isn't just for like a micro sense. I'm talking about the macro sense. So in terms of like a longer term vision, if you're trying to work on something and you, say example, you build, I don't know, say example, you make a restaurant, for example, right? You made like a restaurant, and you get some customers. Maybe you get a little bit of traction, not like crazy amounts, but you get enough to make a little bit of profit every year or something. And you say, hey, you know what we need to do? We need to expand. We need to make another restaurant chain somewhere else, in another city. So you go and do that. You move to point B. That same result happens again. You get a little bit of progress, and you think you're actually making astronomical like developments, and instead you decide to move to the next point and the next point and the next point. And the reason you do that is two reasons. The first reason is because of ego satisfaction. It's so much easier if you are able to get to this top point. There's a lot of, I guess, there's a lot of public recognition that can come from that, and there's also the self satisfaction to think that, oh, I'm this person that's gotten to this point, right? So you're satisfying your ego earlier than you actually should be, because you've not gotten the fundamentals right. And the second reason is because you want to, again, get that dopamine hit much faster. So it's important to just spend more time on the fundamentals, because yes, they are more boring, but until you absolutely master the fundamentals, you will never get this top point correct. And even if you even get there at that point, because there's a good chance you probably won't get there without mastering the fundamentals. You might get to point C, but that's about it. If you have two people and one person just tries to get to the top as fast as they can, whereas the other person, so meaning they're going for breadth, they're going for width, but the other person is just focused on mastering the foundations first and taking their time and getting to the top. So they're focused on depth. The person who focuses on depth is always going to beat the person focused on width. So just something to keep in mind. So let's talk about the next point, which is about content. So content is very, very important. So the general adage that you're probably familiar with is, you are the average of the 5 closest friends that you spend the most time with. However, the modern day version of that is that you are the average of the five content creators that you consume the most, right? Or 5 influencers. Let's just say 5 influences, not influencers, but influences that you consume the most. So, say example, if you, because there's a lot of people do not go out that much these days, or at least quite a lot of people don't go out as much as they used to. You get a lot of people that will stay inside and just consume a lot of content. So if you're watching the same 5 people and they're all negatively minded, you're going to eventually start thinking like them. Even if you consume one person in so much depth and detail, you're going to notice that your thought patterns and your behaviors will reflect something similar to that person, right? And the reason being is because there's a theory by a French philosopher named René Girard, mimetic theory. Essentially the TLDR version of that is, as human beings, we're not exactly blank slates, because we actually adopt. We are not ourselves. We adopt from our influences. So we see other people doing certain things. We try those certain things out, and we see if we enjoy it. If we do, we take that on. If we don't, we don't. But we are not original in that sense. We are kind of just we adopt everything else around us. So if you watch one content creator, for example, you watch Andrew Tate, for example, right? And you watch a lot of his content, like a lot. Like, for example, you watch like all of his podcasts, you watch all of his like Rumble videos, all of his vlogs, whatever, right? You consume all of his content, everything he's saying constantly. You're eventually going to think like him, right? Because because the reason you consume them is because so much is because one of two reasons. Well, 2 reasons. The first reason is that you see a part of yourself in that creator, and the second reason is that you want to be like that creator, or because generally speaking, you'll probably want to watch creator. If you're watching this kind of video, you're probably watching videos that are about self-improvement, being better essentially. So you're going to end up thinking more like them. Whoever you consume is generally going to be someone that ideally you would look up to. Maybe not. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But the first case is definitely true, that you see yourself, at least a portion of yourself, in that person, right? And the more and more you consume that person's content, you will eventually start to behave like them. And if you consume, say, for example, you consume 5 creators at equal proportions in high depth, you'll kind of become an amalgamation of all 5 of those creators. You'll take out some traits from, let's say Andrew Tate. You might take some traits from Sam Ovens. You might take some traits from Hamza, whatever, right? Whoever you watch, right? You will start taking little bits and pieces away from all of them and start acting like a version that's of all 5 of them together, right? So you should be very careful and be very mindful about this, right? So you should be aware that, hey, is this a behavior that I want? Now, I'm not saying that you should like never take any behaviors from anybody, right? Because there are some behaviors that are good for you. Like if you see somebody exercising often and taking care of their body, and you should absolutely do that. That doesn't mean that all behaviors are inherently bad. What it means is that if you consume a creator's content with enough depth in a short period of time, what will end up happening is you will end up becoming more and more like that person, or at least what you perceive that person to be like, because some people have appearances online which are different to how they are in real life, right? So it's just so keep 2 things in mind. First of all, that you are consuming someone else's content, and if you notice your behavior is changing, then you should say, hey, where did this behavior come from? Which creator did I get this from? Or which influence did I get this from? Because it might not even be a YouTuber, it might not be a content creator. It could be a friend, or it could be a mentor, it could be a teacher, it could be one of your relatives, whatever, right? It could be any factor that you just see and observe and notice the behavior in enough depth in a short period of time. So the first thing is just to be mindful about what behaviors about yourself that you're modifying, and secondly, whether you actually want those behaviors and why you want those behaviors, because you might, and thirdly, how different do you believe your perception of their behaviors are versus what their behaviors actually are? Because we, as human beings, we perceive everything in a certain light, but that light might not reflect reality. We all have our own individual truths, but they might not be universal truths. I've written an essay about that. I'll link it down below so you can have a look at the difference between what I wrote about individual truths versus universal truths. But the main point that I'm trying to get at is that your perception doesn't necessarily reflect what reality is. So be mindful of that, and be mindful of the behaviors, and be mindful if you actually want to be exactly like that person, if you're kind of amalgamating all of those things together. So just keep that in mind. So the next point about content, really quickly, that I wanted to touch on is to avoid consuming too much content which can linger onto your other desires, right? So say, for example, you are studying, you're studying for an exam, but you're consuming a lot of videos about video games. Let's say for example, you have like a PlayStation or whatever, you have a video game, let's say like, I don't know, Call of Duty or FIFA or something, and you're consuming a lot of FIFA videos. Your desire to want to play FIFA or Call of Duty or whatever is going to be very high, because you're seeing other people do that, and you can see the possibility of you doing that activity and receiving the same amount of enjoyment, right? So you are going to just go, oh, I don't really want to study. Let me go do this. Let me go do this dopamine indulging activity. Even though you know it's bad for you, but you probably, at that point, you probably just don't care. You're like, I need that hit of dopamine. I need to play that video game. and this applies in so many different realms, but I'm just giving that as a basic example, that if you have desires, right, to do different things, it doesn't necessarily even have to be that. It could be, say, example, mixed martial arts, right? Like if you love like I love martial arts, right? I've been doing it my whole life, but I know that it can take up a lot of time, right? Like I remember when I used to, like, I remember like when I used to do like karate when I was younger as well. It took time out of my week. Whenever you train, even if it's not that, even if it's working out. Like I used to work out, like I still do, but slightly less. But I used to work out quite a lot, and I used to train quite a lot, and I would be consuming a lot of content about training, right? So like how to do different variations of pull-ups, for example, how to do these different exercises. Because I didn't really go to a gym, right? I sort of side note, I kind of basically just made up a gym using equipment that I had like in a kitchen. So I would like flip over like the university, like in the uni, like a shared accommodation. They gave you like sofas and stuff, so I kind of flipped them to the side. I bought like a bar so I could do like some L sit pull ups. Um, yeah, just a side note on that. But essentially, the point I'm getting at is that if you have a focus, something that you need to accomplish, be mindful of consuming other pieces of content that can trigger onto your other desires, right? So like I said before, so for example, your goal is to like do really well in this test in an exam, for example, in school, and you decide to watch a bunch of like FIFA gamer streamers. Your desire to indulge in that activity will be really high, and at that point you're relying on your conscious willpower. And in general, human beings have a very low conscious strength when it comes to their willpower. Some people do have a lot of like inherent strength when it comes to willpower, but that's something that has to be practiced and trained very frequently by doing very difficult and uncomfortable things enough times to build up that willpower to do things that you don't want to do. Um, Essentially. So make things easier for yourself and that can avoid content and influences that can trigger your distractive desires, right? So just be mindful about for content. So now that we've talked about distraction, let's talk about how to actually focus. So I realize I've taken up quite a lot of time just talking about distraction, but it's such an important topic. So let's talk about focus. So how do you focus? The first thing to do is to define a North Star. So imagine this. This is the point that you want to get at. I don't know how well that comes off. I mean, it looks sort of legible. I'll try to make it a bit bigger. But is that a bit better? It's a bit better. So define your North Star, meaning the things that actually matter, right? And then discard the rest. So this is where you want to go to. And imagine like these arrows, or you like imagine this is like an activity, right? So let's just put these dots. These dots can be activities. That's the right activity. This might be distraction, for example, right? You want to define what actually matters to you, what your North Star is. So, for example, I've got a couple of examples here. So, say example, if you're running a business, then the two things that should be on your mind first and foremost above everything else. So, things that will matter would be, for example, product, right? Having an exceptional product, and B is customers, making sure that you are giving your customers a phenomenal experience whilst using your product or service, right? That matters. Things that don't matter would be things like press, right? Because that's not exactly helpful. That's just ego satisfaction for the most part. Sure, it can definitely give you some sort of credibility and validation, but really speaking, it's not helping. It's not moving the main needle forward, which is building an exceptional product and delivering a lot of value to your customers, right? The other examples I gave, I've got another example for school. So, for example, if you're in school, then the two things that will matter the most to you would be getting good grades and getting feedback on things that you could do better so you can improve the grade. So really speaking, the number one thing in that case would be like grades. So let's just call this, let's just put this as, I just put 1 here. So this is like the number one thing, which is grades. And the way you get it would be through getting feedback and doing certain activities like work. Let's just call it work. So like studying, practicing past papers, making sure you attend all your classes, whatever. Things that would be distracting would be, buying colorful notes, for example, right? So if you buy colorful notes, that's not helping you get better grades. If you are doing press, that's not helping you deliver more value to your customers or build a better product, right? If you're an athlete, then what matters? Having a good diet, having good technique in whatever sport you're doing, and making sure you're exercising right and making sure that you're resting properly and recovering. That matters. What doesn't matter is press, what your style is like, doing all these interviews. Like, they can help you in your career in a sense in terms of getting fame, and that could and you could argue that would help you get to a higher level in your like athletic career. But in terms of being a better athlete, that doesn't, if you see what I mean. So identify the North Star and the things that actually matter, and that identify the activities which actually move the needle closer or take the right direction towards that North Star, versus activities which are just ego satisfactions and are complete non-obvious distractions, right? The next step is to be self-aware. So acknowledge where your desires lie. So say, for example, you're interested in playing, say, for example, you love playing Fortnite or something, or you love writing music, right? I'm not saying those desires are not unfounded or that they're not unjustified and you shouldn't have them, but you should acknowledge the fact that you do have those desires. Everyone has something that they care about, right? That is a distraction from what they're actually supposed to be doing. So identify what exactly your crutches are, essentially, because they are things that are distractions, whether they're obvious, most likely obvious distractions. They are crutches. So identify what is actually a crutch. So if you're in school, I'm just going to give a school example because it's just easier to think of. But if you're in school and you are, like I said, you're supposed to get your North Star of getting good grades, but your crutches are playing Fortnite, writing music, for example. I don't know, maybe just Photoshop or something. I don't know, doing these creative things. And I'm not saying creative things are bad, and you should definitely allocate a certain time in a week to do creative things, or things that are not necessarily 100% goal oriented towards one specific focus, but they are distractions to your end goal. I'm using it in a more literal sense, right? So yeah, just be honest with yourself about what's actually what things do you like, do you enjoy doing, things that you think are exciting, interesting, and try to identify what those crutches are. And if they're not particularly beneficial, like they're not creative endeavors, or they're not, things that are making you a better person, you should try to cut them out of your life if you can. But if you can't, then try to time box a certain period of time per week or per day or something where you can engage in those activities. But you need to be aware about what desires you have, and you need to be aware of what your North Star is, because your desires can stop you from getting to your North Star, because your desires will force you to want to engage into things that are not moving the needle forward, essentially. The next step is to find ways to make tasks engaging. So you need to find ways to make the boring not boring. So how do you do that? There's different ways you could do it, but the way that I find that could be helpful is just speed, right? So say example, the task is to tap the pen lid as many times as I can. Let's say example, I have to tap this pen lid, right? Let's say, how do I make that more fun? how many times can I do it in 10 seconds? Right? Being able to just compare yourself and just say, hey, how fast can I do XYZ thing? Maybe that can make things more engaging. But you can just play around with ways to make your work more engaging. Or even if the other way, if you don't want to get into speed, is by slowing down and giving yourself the mental like bandwidth to focus on something intently and just like, okay, I'm going to get this thing done, even if it's boring. Because even boring things, if you focus enough on it, can become interesting to you. That's what I certainly found. Like I remember, like, I think it's the case with anyone. Like if you do like homework or something in school, but it's generally very boring. But if you're actually focusing on it for a long enough period of time, it kind of becomes slightly more interesting. So that's something that I would keep in mind. So the first thing would be to either focus on speed, or if you can't focus on speed, then focus on slowing down and going into depth on something. Essentially, pick one of those two because that's generally the easiest way to do it. The next point that I have, and the final point, is how to stay motivated when being focused. Because if you're doing a lot of boring work, as fun as you can make it, sometimes it's still going to be pretty boring. So how can you make it fun? The first thing is tracking progress, right? And the way you track progress, the reason you need to track progress, first of all, is because you cannot improve what you do not track, right? And it kind of works in like a self-fulfilling cycle. I realize I'm probably overusing this whiteboard, probably too much for the sake of these examples, but I'm going to use it here. So let's say example, we've got this cycle, right, of progress. So you make progress and you see an improvement that motivates you to progress more, and you keep tracking that progress and you keep improving a little bit each time, and you get more motivated. So the reason that you track progress is firstly because you can't improve what you do not measure, and second of all, when you track your progress, you can firstly see where you're making a downfall, where you're falling short, and the second point of tracking progress is you will be motivated by that progress, right? Like yes, you hear online like, yes, you should be motivated by passion. I don't think that a lot of things are very exciting. So the way you can motivate yourself is by measuring your progress and being able to actually see progress, right? It's very easy to just go, oh yeah, arbitrarily this is like sort of motivating. Like, for example, if you're trying to lose weight or gain muscle, and you kind of just go, oh, okay, I feel like I'm a bit bigger in weight, I feel like I'm a bit stronger, or I feel like I'm a bit slimmer, but you're not measuring it, you're not going to be as motivated to continue compared to saying, okay, I'm tracking my weight, I'm taking pictures of my of each week of my progress, right? Like of my fitness journey, how I'm building muscle or how I'm losing weight, and then you kind of just see from where you started to where you are now, and you see the difference there, you see the progress you've made, and that motivates you to even go further, because you're like, if I've gotten this far, imagine how much further I can go. So it kind of, that's why I drew out the cycle, right? So you make progress and you track it, you see it, if there's improvement, you see it and it motivates you, and then from there you make more progress and you keep tracking it, and it motivates you more to take more action and so on. And hopefully over time that kind of builds into a habit, and ideally a disciplined habit, meaning when you don't feel like doing something, you're able to do it when motivation runs short. And that's essentially it. That's basically everything that you need to know about how to focus in, I guess, the macro and both the micro, in focusing on being able to do a task intently, for example, like staying engaged, as well as thinking about the macro side of things. So being able to identify what are obvious and non-obvious distractions in achieving the North Star. If you found this video helpful, please share it. If you did enjoy it, then also please leave a like and hit a subscribe button. And if you have any suggestions for future topics for videos like this, then please let me know in the comment section. Thanks.